Good evening and welcome to tonight's discussion on nature-based solutions to climate change in Minnesota. The discussion is hosted by the Sustainability Project of the Grove United Methodist Church. I'm Jim Urkel and I'm a member of the Sustainability Project, and I'll be moderating the discussion. The project hosts events in the spring and the fall to reach out to our congregation and the surrounding community to discuss how we should fulfill our obligation to care for and maintain God's creation. Several of our events have dealt with climate change and the actions that we need to take as individuals, congregations, and communities to mitigate the effects of climate change on Minnesota's economy and environment, and to adapt to the effects that cannot be mitigated. In this effort, the Sustainability Project is guided by the United Methodist Church's Book of Discipline, which lays out several social principles relating to our responsibility for the natural world. Principles agree with the IPCC's assessment that climate change results from human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. They caution that the adverse effects of climate change disproportionately affect individuals and communities less responsible for and least likely to have benefited from the greenhouse gas emissions. And last, they call in individuals, congregations, businesses, industries, and communities to reduce their emissions. We return to those issues again tonight. In 2007, Minnesota passed the Next Generation Energy Act. It set short, mid, and long-term goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from Minnesota's 2005 levels. Since then, Minnesota has completed 2 rounds of planning for climate action and is engaged in the 3rd round, being led by Governor Walz's climate change sub-cabinet. As you will see, though, we have missed Next Gen's short-term goal of a 15% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2015, and it's generally agreed that we are unlikely to hit the midterm goal of a 30% reduction by 2025. This is not to say that action has not been taken. At the start, electrical generation was the sector of Minnesota's economy that had the highest annual rate of greenhouse gas emissions. The section has seen substantial reductions as a result of the changing economics of renewable energy and the ability to make use of energy resource planning requirements for utilities at Minnesota's Public Utilities Commission. Recently, transportation has moved past electrical generation as the sector with the highest annual rates of emissions. And you may have heard that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency recently adopted the California Clean Car Standards, which include greenhouse gas requirements for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In some ways, though, these actions can be viewed as the low-hanging fruit of climate action. They've resulted or will result in substantial reductions, but they're simply not enough. Previous planning rounds and the work of the climate sub-cabinet now have identified a series of actions by sector of Minnesota's economy that can be taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. However, there is no one grand solution. Rather, we may succeed in bending total emissions down if we can sum up all of the reductions, all of the wedges of greenhouse gas emission reductions from a host of solutions that have already been identified. Tonight, we will hear about the role that caring for and maintaining Minnesota's natural and working lands can play in helping both climate mitigation and adaptation. Nature Conservancy recently released a report entitled Nature and Climate Solutions for Minnesota. It makes the case for undertaking natural climate solutions, which when you add up all of the wedges of potential reductions for greenhouse gas emissions from all of the actions that are being proposed, could represent as much as 15% of Minnesota's annual greenhouse gas emissions. We will hear a presentation by Sachiko Graber, one of the co-authors of the Conservancy's report. We'll then hear reactions from a panel consisting of David Wyrens from the Board of Water and Soil Resources, John Loomis with the South Washington Watershed District, and Wallace Wad, the first chair of our Sustainability Project, who has been leading the effort to sustain the grove of trees after which the Grove United Methodist Church is named, and which in some cases represents old growth predating European settlement of Minnesota. We'll start with each of the participants introducing themselves and their work. We will begin with Sachi and hear from the members of the panel. After that, we will move forward with Sachi's presentation. So Sachi, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Jim, and good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here with you all. Again, my name is Sachiko Graber. I am the Climate Policy Manager for the Nature Conservancy in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, and I use she, her pronouns. I just wanted to provide, we'll get more into this, but I wanted to provide the quick overview of the Nature Conservancy before we get into the talk. We're a global conservation organization. We've been around for about 70 years, and we work in 70-some countries and across the US, focused on three main strategies. First, we think about protecting land and water. So that's sort of our long-term traditional conservation work. We think about what it means to provide food and water sustainably. And finally, we have a new and emerging body of work focused on tackling climate change. So I think very relevant to this conversation is this fact that for a long time, we've been kind of aware that climate change was, an emerging issue, but it felt like it was a little incompatible with many of our more traditional work streams, thinking about conserving the land, buying and protecting land. It really wasn't clear to a lot of our communities until recently how intertwined, how intersectional all of these issues are, and how climate change really touches every part of our lives and all of our work as well. So I'm pretty excited to dive into the topic of climate change here today. I lead the climate mitigation work for our chapter across the 3 states. So thinking about how are we reducing emissions and drawing down carbon from the atmosphere, primarily using nature. And that's kind of what we'll get into in just a couple of minutes here.
Great, let's go with Dave Wirens then.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to be here tonight. My name is Dave Wirens. I'm an assistant director with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. We are a fairly small state agency, just about 120 employees statewide. Our focus, as you might imagine, is on conserving, preserving, and protecting and restoring our state's water and soil resources, with the focus on private lands and in working through local partners. A big part of our work is directly partnering with counties, soil and water conservation districts, watershed districts, and other local and non-governmental entities as part of our work in achieving landscape restoration across the state. And in my work for the board, I oversee our work in wetlands protection with the buffer program you may have heard about a few years ago. I work with engineering and permanent land protection as well, and also within climate change. I oversee our work in that area as well, which is a growing and expanding part of our work. One thing I always find kind of interesting about climate change, whenever you're restoring a human-altered landscape, be it an urban area or agricultural land, to a natural setting, that in fact is responding to climate change. A big part of work really involves 2 parts. It's adaptation. It's acknowledging that our weather and our rainfall patterns are changing. How do we ensure that our landscape can accommodate those changing systems? And on the part of sequestration, again, establishing native and diverse plantings on 1,000 acres across the landscape does in fact hold both water in the landscape, which again is an adaptation piece, but also sequesters carbon through those deep-rooted, when you're going from a shallow-rooted annual crop to a more deep-rooted perennial native species as well. So I've often thought that at our agency, we've always been about climate change and about responding to it. However, we never thought about it that way. And I think once you start thinking about it a bit differently, it does force us to take a close look at how we're doing our work, kind of where we're doing it and how we're doing it. And that's really a big part of the work of the climate subcabinet that's been established by Governor Walz. It is starting to change how we're doing our work to be more focused on addressing these primary needs as our climate change, of how do we adapt to live within a changed environment, but also how do we, through natural and working lands efforts, can we further sequester carbon within the landscape of the state? So I look forward to hearing Sachi's presentation and being part of the discussion later on.
Great. Okay, John, you're up.
All right. Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me. Just apologize beforehand. I think some of you might hear my dog barking in the background. He's been sleeping all day, so he's his playtime, and he's not happy not being in here anymore. My name is John Loomis. I work for the South Washington Watershed District, where I'm the program manager of a number of programs, all in some way related to water resources. And one of those includes a focus on climate adaptation and resiliency. And adaptation is our focus at South Washington Watershed District. And I think Sachi will get into the distinction between mitigation and adaptation in our presentation. But our focus is on adaptation. So preparing for the changes we already have seen and the changes we expect to continue seeing going into the future. And the way we are approaching adaptation is to build resiliency into the systems in the southern part of Washington County, at least as much as we can within our purview of program areas and systems we operate in. So the lakes and streams, wetlands, all of the stormwater systems that drain water to those systems, and also increasingly with increasing storm rate events, our farmlands out in the lower St. Croix area or in southern Cottage Grove. We have a number of agricultural lands that are under South Washington's jurisdiction that we're increasingly concerned about erosion coming off of those fields and flowing into our rivers and lakes. But I think, watershed districts generally are well positioned to lead some of the adaptation work in Minnesota, largely because we have always been focused on, more or less disaster events. And so a disaster event could be something as, a flash flood or severe degradation of a lake or a mass wasting event of a bluff into a stream area. All those are disasters that watershed districts have been concerned with and managing towards for a long time. And all of them result from a number of different factors. Poor land use decisions, lack of operation and maintenance, a degraded land cover, species dying out, trees dying. So losing some of that cohesiveness of the soil. And for us, the changing climate is one more factor influencing the potential for those disasters and potentially making those disasters worse. So while we can work to, and we do work to restore landscapes, get deeper rooted vegetation in place, get more trees in place, address aquatic invasive species, we're also taking a look at some of those other factors. So going back and addressing some of the poor land use decisions in the past, helping our cities get caught up on the backlog of maintenance, improving operations of existing systems. Knowing that if we can get a handle on some of those risks, it makes a more resilient system overall. So while we continue to try to get up to speed in helping systems respond directly to climate change, we can make them stronger overall and more resilient as we go forward.
Great, thanks, John. Oh, all right, you're up, Wally.
Well, thank you. My name is Wally Want, and I am a member of the Grove and a member of the sustainability team. And I've been elected tonight to represent our team, and I'm happy to do that. I am a retired pharmacist, and I tell people that I've been rewired to be an environmental activist. So that's my vocation now. And just a little bit about our team. We have a mission statement that says we are to promote the care of God's creation by adopting practices that make our church campuses more sustainable and by working with our community on sustainable practices and environmental justice. And our vision is for the Grove to be recognized in the community as a leader in conservation, sustainability, renewable energy, and an advocate for climate justice. Just a little bit of history. In 2016, solar panels were installed on the roof of our church, and that sparked the formation of our current team. And to date, some of our activities have included a comprehensive energy audit done to identify opportunities to conserve energy. We've replaced all the LED lights and the solar panels and all the LED lights that we've installed have reduced our electricity we buy from Xcel Energy by 40% and our electricity bill by 25%. And we are now participating in Xcel's renewable energy programs to eventually obtain 100% of our electricity needs from renewable resources by 2025. And we are also following up on the audit to implement energy conservation improvements to our church facility. And I will turn it back to Jim.
Great. So we're ready now for Sachi to make her presentation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And is everybody seeing the presentation okay here?
I am.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you again for the chance to present today. And just for this event in general, I think it's really great and important that we're starting to come together more to discuss a lot of these issues. Again, I just wanted to repeat, my name is Sachiko Graber. I work for the Nature Conservancy. And I'm really excited to dive into this topic of nature and climate change. You know, what do they have to do with each other? How is that conversation going? And where do we need to get to, given the urgency and the need for climate action, as has kind of already been elevated in this introduction period. So just the high level overview here. I'm breaking this up into roughly 3 sections. First, focusing on the climate science. It sounds like many of the folks on this call are already steeped in the science. You're close to experts on these issues, but I do think it's really important for us to ground these conversations in the science and to kind of arm ourselves with the facts for when we get into these conversations. Second, we'll talk a little bit about nature as a climate solution. How does that work? It tends to be a type of climate solution that hasn't gotten elevated much lately. And so what really is the role of nature, of natural lands, of working lands in combating climate change? And then finally, we'll spend, oh, I'm so sorry. I did not realize I was sharing the wrong screen. Let's try that again. How's that?
Nope, it looks the same.
Really?
I think you need to put it into slideshow mode.
Believe it or not, it is. One more try.
There we
That's
go.
good.
Yeah. All right. Sorry for the technical difficulties, everyone. It would not be a pandemic call over Zoom if we didn't have some of those. Finally, I promise we'll get a little bit into, you know, really what can we do? What should we be doing as stewards, as the folks who are caring for the planet? What is our role here? So to kick it off, we'll start with kind of the climate science and where that all stands. I apologize, this is the wonkiest slide we'll have, and then we'll sort of pull back and get more general. But just to start at the very beginning, and again, I know everyone is already familiar with this, we know that climate change is driven by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, right? And we know that those greenhouse gases are largely emitted by fossil fuels, although there are also other sources of greenhouse gases. And as you can kind of see on this chart on the left, what we've seen historically is our emissions going up, right? Every year we emit more greenhouse gases. And so that's fueling climate change and fueling the amount of global warming that we're seeing. And again, that's complicated because we know that global warming does not necessarily mean warming everywhere around the globe. Temperature is just a really easy metric for us to measure. We all know how to measure temperature, and we can find averages for the temperature around the world. We know that climate change will cause some places to get colder, some places will get hotter, some places will get weirder, some places will get more storms, some places will get drier. And so warming and global warming are just the metric that we tend to use to talk about that. So given our historical trends, given the fact that we know greenhouse gas emissions have been rising over time, right now, we can say our baseline, our expectation if things continue as usual, is that we'll hit global warming of almost 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. 5 degrees Celsius, for those of you who are not math majors, I had to look this up, it's like 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So on the one hand, 9 degrees Fahrenheit really isn't that big of a deal, right? If it's 70 or 79 outside, I can tell the difference, but I'm fine either way. So I really wanted to dig into why does that matter? And I'm focusing here again on our landscape impacts. Well, what we see in Minnesota is that 9 degrees Fahrenheit of warming is enough to drive 95% local extinction. So that means if you look out your window right now, 95% of all of the plants, all of the insects, all of the little invertebrates that are living in the soil, all the little bugs, 95% of them will no longer be able to live in your area. We'll have human impacts, right? Sickness, people getting sick and potentially dying because we'll have 70 days of extreme heat every year in Minnesota. And economic impacts where we're seeing some of our agricultural yields crashing. So to me, that 5 degrees or 9 Fahrenheit, that level of warming is just something that it's untenable. It's not something that we want to see happen to Minnesota. So then we can go back and kind of ask, okay, what happens if we bend the curve? And believe it or not, this was a climate term before it was a COVID term. Bending the curve would mean reducing our emissions so that we start to see them drop over time. And right now we have a lot of policies in place, right? Jim mentioned the Next Generation Energy Act in Minnesota. We have a lot of federal targets and plans and goals. If we can implement all of those, we can stay in the 2.5 degrees of warming phase. Well, 2.5 degrees of warming is better, right? At 2.5 degrees, we see 70 local bird species go extinct, not 95% of them. That's about a third. We see, 35,000 winter recreation jobs affected because we have 3 weeks less winter every year. And we see some economic damage in the agriculture sector, but it's not as bad. I'm a bird watcher. I would be devastated if we lost 70 bird species in Minnesota. And so then we have to go back and ask, what else can we do, right? And for those of you who have been following the news and following the climate conversation, we know that IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, as well as our national government, have been talking a lot about 1.5 degrees. How can we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees? And that is a big lift. We've already warmed by about 1 degree Celsius. So we really need to bend the curve. We need to cut emissions in half by 2030 and then reach 0 by 2050. And what does that do? Well, that keeps us at less than 20% species loss in Minnesota. Yes, that is still enough warming to see declines in some of our northern forests, but we'll see a lot of the conifers from central Minnesota pushing up and taking over that forest land. Yes, that means we will see fewer cold water fish, but we'll also see more bass. We'll also see other types of fish rising to take that role. So really, for me, this 1.5 degree region is where we want and need to try to be. So then the question becomes, how do we do that, right? I just said we need to cut emissions in half by 2030. And that is a big lift. That means as individuals, right, you might think about driving half as many miles, or half of the congregation beginning to drive electric vehicles by 2030. If you use natural gas for heat, you might think about using your heater half as often. You might think about consuming half as much plastic. That's a lot. And that's something that, it's too much for individuals to take on. So we need to think about what are the bigger systems level solutions that can get us there. So here's what our emissions landscape looks like in Minnesota today. There really are only 3 big sources of emissions in this state. Transportation. Jim mentioned that transportation is now the biggest source of emissions in Minnesota. Electricity, and agriculture and land use. So really, if we want to think about cutting emissions in half by 2030, what we need to do is focus on these 3 sectors and find ways to drastically change our impact. And the good news is that there's already a lot happening in Minnesota. If you've been following the legislature or following state policy at all, you may have seen that we passed the Clean Cars Rule this past spring. So that means there will be new availability of electric vehicles and zero emission vehicles in the state to start that transition. There's a lot of conversation about low carbon fuels. So how are we using biofuels? How are we using electric vehicles? We're moving the needle on transportation. I would say the same on the electricity front. Obviously, we still have more to do in both of these sectors, but we're learning how to build out our renewable energy resources. We're learning how to use energy efficiency measures to reduce the amount of fossil energy we need. The sector here out of these three where we don't hear a lot of discussion of climate solutions is honestly, it's in land use. And we know that we have a vast resource in our natural and working lands. It's just one that really hasn't been quite as elevated. And it's a little more complicated, honestly, because we have a lot of land in Minnesota. And so that means a lot of different types of solutions to piece together to solve this puzzle. I wanted to pause for a second here just to introduce these terms for folks who might not be quite as familiar. So we talk a lot in the climate world about mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation refers to efforts that reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, reduces carbon, reduces emissions, or pulls carbon out of the atmosphere. And there are really two major ways we have to do that right now. One is renewable energy. So rather than burning coal, rather than burning natural gas, replacing those energy resources with something clean like wind or solar. And that kind of leaks into the transportation sector as well, because at least with passenger vehicles, the most climate friendly solution we have right now is to use electric vehicles that are running on clean power. The other big solution we have, though, is thinking about nature. If we think about this transition to renewable energy, that is reducing the amount of greenhouse gases that we're actively emitting, right? If you picture kind of like a release from the surface of the planet, we'll be releasing less carbon into the atmosphere. We also need to find ways to suck that carbon back down. And actually, nature is really great at that. We don't have fantastic technical solutions yet, but we all learned in, I don't know, elementary school, middle school, about photosynthesis, where plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. And so that is plants breathing in carbon from the atmosphere and effectively taking it out of the air. When plants grow, when trees grow, that's carbon turning into their biomass. And then when they die, the matter disintegrates, decays, and some of that carbon goes back into the soil and is stored in the ground. So the more plants we have, the healthier our landscapes are, the more carbon we can also be sequestering, pulling out of the air using nature. And those are really carbon-focused strategies. I do want to point to adaptation as well, because it's not just about preventing future climate change. We're already seeing climate change. We're already locked into a certain amount of climate change. And we know that more floods, more droughts, more heat waves, more cold snaps, those have impacts on both people and on our environment. On the one hand, we need to make sure that our communities are resilient. And I'm glad we'll have some experts here in our panel to talk a little bit more about this direct connection to adaptation, but we know that nature can help us to adapt. We also know that nature needs our help adapting. And so there's kind of this two-way interplay here where we need to help our landscapes remain healthy, remain resilient, so that they can help us weather those major storms. One final piece on the science here. As we're talking about climate solutions, we really do also need to be thinking about equity. And I know equity is a word that gets bandied about a lot these days, and sometimes it feels like, is there even any meaning behind it? But in this case, yes, there is. On the left here, I have a map of energy injustice in the Twin Cities. And you see that those red areas, which are less just, are really focused in the inner cities. So what drives energy injustice? Well, we're really thinking about, as a household, what % of your income goes to pay your electricity bill or your energy bill. So there's a couple of things that go into that, right? One, if I have the same number of lights in my house and I make less money, a greater % of my income is going to my energy bill. Two, we know that many low-income housing units, we know that many more affordable housing options are less well insulated. They're less well constructed. They're not as nice of buildings. And so you end up paying more for heating or cooling because the product is leaking out of your house. We also have the urban heat island effect happening here, where downtowns tend to be hotter, and compounding that is the fact that downtowns tend to have fewer trees, and actually poorer neighborhoods in general tend to have fewer trees. We know that trees create shade, and when we're talking about summer heat waves and global warming, shade can be a really critical resource. And so in addition to having, say, your air conditioning leaking out of your house and already paying too much of your income to cover your electricity bill on those really, really hot summer days, you're either paying even more because your house is roasting under the sun with no shade trees, or you face health risks because your house is heating up so much and maybe you don't have access to air conditioning. So there are a lot of layers there, and one that we know that nature is certainly one of a suite of solutions to address. At the same time, I also just wanted to point out there's a lot of data out there on economic impacts of climate change, and all of the data tell the same story, which is that poorer people bear a larger burden of climate impacts. They tend to be the ones whose houses are flooded or damaged. They tend to be the ones whose work is impacted. They tend to be the ones with more outside occupations who are impacted by, say, really hot days when you can't go to work. So there's a lot of factors playing together here. That being said, we'll keep the equitable solutions concept in our minds as we go forward to thinking about the role that nature can actually play here. So I wanted first and foremost to point towards this resource. This is a report that the Nature Conservancy actually put out just this January, so less than a year ago, summarizing the opportunity of nature to be a climate solution in Minnesota. And the big takeaway here is that in our state, with our current emissions, natural and working lands could offset 15% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So that's huge. But the question then becomes, how do we activate that, right? As we're talking about cutting emissions in half by 2030, it would be great to get 15% of the way there only using the land, but how do we actually make that happen? Well, you see a huge opportunity here in the agriculture space on those yellow bars. Our agricultural lands are, one, pervasive, and two, have a lot of opportunity to store more carbon. A lot of our soil has really been degraded over time through farming, through tillage, through plowing, through various types of nutrient management. And we know that, Minnesota is a great farming state because our soil has the capacity to hold so many nutrients. So a couple of things we can do are to get those nutrients and get the carbon back into the soil. This huge bar at the top here is cover cropping, which is just keeping plants on the soil all year round so that the carbon doesn't get released from the soil during the winter. If you think about photosynthesis, if you think about plants turning carbon into biomass and putting that carbon into the soil, really we're just talking about the math here of having plants on the landscape 12 months a year rather than 4 months a year. We also have a huge opportunity in the forests that we love in Minnesota. There are 3 or 4 or 5 million acres of land that were historically forested that could be reforested. And we know that trees just hold immense capacity to store carbon. We know that trees also provide shade and provide all kinds of other ecosystem benefits. We also know that there are ways to manage our land that can help store more carbon. So thinking about how are we managing our forests? How are we managing and restoring our wetlands, our peatlands, our grasslands? All of those landscapes have huge potential to help us on the carbon front. So I'm hoping this will load, lest I did not explain that clearly, because I know these concepts get a little wonky sometimes. I wanted to share a quick video that's part of our Trees, Water, Soil campaign, which is just an effort by the Nature Conservancy to try to share this type of information and share these stories about why nature really matters. Just let me know if you can't hear this.
Trees, water, soil. three building blocks of our lives, economies, and our future. As we deal with the challenges and risks brought on by a changing climate, we often overlook the ability of nature to create the conditions needed for life to thrive. Nature alone can draw down carbon pollution by 30% of what's needed to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And yet, nature is currently receiving only 3% of the funding spent on tackling climate change. It's time we started investing more in nature. Actions like protecting and restoring our forests, wetlands, and grasslands, as well as agricultural practices like cover cropping and reduced tillage, reduce emissions and remove pollution from the air. In the state of Minnesota alone, nature-based solutions have the potential to offset greenhouse gas emissions by 26 million metric tons. That's the equivalent of taking 7 coal-fired power plants offline. And nature can help communities adapt to climate change through simple actions like planting trees or adding rain gardens, all while making our air and water cleaner, protecting our communities and property from flooding, enriching our economy and our lives. We need to take action on climate, and nature is the simplest and most cost-effective solution. Our future depends on more trees, cleaner water, and healthier soils.
So one thing I really like about that video is that it highlights kind of the breadth of solutions that we know these strategies can provide. It's not just about carbon. And if I'm being honest, planting trees just for the carbon value, there might be a couple of us who geek out about that, but that's not really what's going to drive most people. What will drive us is the shade benefits. What will drive us is the habitat creation. What will drive us is the improved water quality in the Mississippi, where we get a lot of our drinking water. So one of the benefits of these solutions is that they are so broad. They provide such a wide suite of services that really kind of touch down in all the different parts of our lives. So we can find something in them that's interesting, that's attractive, that makes us want to care. Oops, sorry. I wanted to provide one quick example of the work we're doing as TNC, as the Nature Conservancy here in Minnesota. We're a part of this broad effort to reforest 1 million acres in Minnesota. So I mentioned there are, several million acres of reforestation potential. We're saying, can we actually reforest 1 million of those acres before 2040? Because we really know that those carbon sequestration benefits are huge. I work out of the office, and I want to say that saying the words 1 million acres is pretty easy for me, but this is not a simple task on the ground. We're talking about, something like 800 million seedlings, which right now we don't have the capacity in the state to grow that many trees, or to grow that many seedlings to be planted. We're talking about something like almost $2 billion to make that happen, between growing and purchasing the seedlings, between capacity to plant them, and the work required to maintain them for the first couple of years to make sure they grow up healthy. So that's a huge effort. But one thing that I really just think is super cool about this map is you see that there's opportunity everywhere in the state. So when I hear the word reforestation, I tend to think that that's just something that matters up north. That's just something for the North Woods. What does that really mean for me? But what we see is the opportunity is really all throughout the state. And it actually kind of focuses on this prairie forest border region, where we've seen a lot of trees cut and land converted for other uses. You'll also notice that there's actually quite a bit of green in this big map in the greater metro area. So we're thinking about, what are all the possible places where we could put more trees where they could be storing carbon, and what would it take to make that happen? And I want to point out that even though there are a huge number of organizations here, and even though certainly the state will have a big role to play in an effort like this, a lot of this would be on private land. A lot of this would be folks like us, who are thinking about, where can I fit 3 more trees in my yard? Or if you have, a cabin up north, is there an acre in there that we can replant? And all those small efforts are going to add up to something that actually is hugely impactful for the state in terms of our climate response. I had one more video to share. I think we're going to skip it just for time, but we do have this Trees, Water, Soil campaign that is really focused on stories. And so the bulk of the videos are Minnesotans who are using natural climate solutions. So the story is that he's a rancher who is protecting the grassland and restoring the grassland because of his ranch, but it also comes out to have carbon benefits, and it also comes out to have adaptation benefits because he's maintaining a healthy landscape. So here's the crux, right? What happens next? What do we do from here? I want to point out just before we get into any specific actions that here's what we know, right? We talked about the need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but we have enough climate solutions to get there. We know how to install renewable energy. We know how to install batteries. We know how to use electric vehicles. We know how to use biofuels, and we know how to plant trees or plant cover crops or use nature as a solution. So we have enough solutions to get there. We know that we need to start now because every day we wait, there are impacts of climate change, and those are just getting worse. And we know that we need more voices in the conversation. This is not just about inclusivity and about voicing what we want to see from the state, but this is about how we're caring for the planet. We know that political will, unfortunately, can be one of the biggest constraints to climate action. And we also know that individual change isn't really going to be enough in this fight, right? Not only can I not imagine what it would take for me to get rid of my carbon footprint. I mean, I still have to drive to work sometimes. I still need my heater in the winter. But a handful of individuals making that type of drastic change will actually not have the same impact as systemic change to how our state and our systems and our economy operates. So here's a couple thoughts, and I'm looking forward to exploring these more in the discussion afterwards. I truly believe that we need to be working together and we need to be pushing for system scale change. So the first thing on my list here is advocacy. I work for the Nature Conservancy, so of course I would love for you to sign up to advocate with us, but it really doesn't matter. If there's an organization whose efforts align with your views, or if you happen to have a relationship with an elected official or somebody in the government, use your voice. If you're interested, if you have a smartphone and just hold the camera up to this QR code, it'll take you right to the sign up page for our advocacy efforts, and you can kind of follow what we're doing as the Nature Conservancy. But find ways, right, to voice your opinion and to make sure that we're taking sufficient action. If you have the means, donate. And I don't mean to put any pressure on this. You don't have to donate to TNC, it can be someone else. But again, it is the broader efforts here that really will have the capacity to change the way we do things at a landscape scale. And third, these are really not order of importance because this one should have been first. Weigh in on the Minnesota climate plan. I'm guessing that Dave will say more about this, but the state is really doing an exceptional job thinking through what do we need to be doing that will be sufficient for climate change. And they have this platform right now, it's up online, where they're asking for your opinions. They're asking, what do you think we need to do? What are your priorities? You know, if you want us to invest in clean transportation, what exactly should we be doing? If you want to protect natural and working lands, what are the ways that you want to see us do that? So if you have the time and capacity, I would check out that website, and you can upvote other ideas, or you can throw in some of your own. And finally, I know that if I were in the audience, I would not just want to be hearing, you know, support other organizations, try to be a part of the system. I want to know what I can do. So it sounds like, you know, as a community, the Grove has already been doing a lot on this front, but build those nature-based strategies and clean energy solutions into your plans. You know, it sounds like you've already done fantastic work on the renewable energy and the you know, forest protection front. What are the other things you can do? Are there places where, you know, native prairie landscapes would fit? Are there places where you can get more trees out there? Are there ways you can support those efforts in other places? And I did want to flag here, whether it's for you as an individual or for the church community, trees, as well as everything else these days, are a little complicated. We're seeing the emerald ash borer really devastate a lot of the urban trees in our communities. So in order to avoid that going forward, we know already that there are some trees that are not going to fare super well with climate change. And we know that there are other species that will be much more resilient. So I put this resource in here. NIAX has a really great summary based in the science, based on research of which trees are likely to be more resilient in the face of weirder, more variable weather. And I would really check that out as a resource. Finally, getting really to the individual or the household level, there are lots of tools to calculate your carbon footprint. The EPA has a great one. I think TNC probably has one. I don't think the numbers matter personally, but what this can do is help you identify what are the parts of your life that are having a major greenhouse gas impact, and think about how you could reduce that. And then finally, follow up. I just think conversation on these issues, creating community where we can work together on these issues that are so important to us, I think that's critical. So if you want, follow the Nature Conservancy. We're on Facebook and Twitter and maybe other platforms. Reach out to me if you have questions. And above all else, I mean, find the actions that are calling you, find the actions that are giving you energy. Even if you can only do one thing on climate change, that's more than before. So that's it for me. I'll pause here, and I'm really looking forward to diving deeper into some of these concepts as we get into the discussion and hearing what the panel has to say.
Great. Thank you, Sachi, for your presentation. We're going to turn now to the members of the panel to react to the presentation, and we'll start with Dave.
All right. Oh, there you go. Let's wait for my video to pop up again. Thank you for that presentation, Sashi. There's a lot of in-depth information there, and climate change is extremely complicated. Only maybe slightly less complicated are the actions we can take as a state society to respond to climate change. And let me say just a few things about the work of the state and my own agency, the Board of Water and Soil Resources. Sashi is correct. There is as been mentioned a few times already, the Governor Walz has established a climate subcabinet that is made up of many of these state agencies. And one of the key things we're working on right now is the climate action framework. And I believe that's what Sashi was referring to in terms of what we're looking for input as a state. And this climate action framework is built into 5 sections that really encompass all those sectors of impact that Sashi referred to in one of her very early slides. There's a sector dealing with transportation, natural working lands, resilient communities, power and buildings, and health equity and jobs. And I would encourage you to go to the website. It's climate.state.mn.us, where you can both learn more information of what's going on with the subcabinet, and also opportunity to provide your input. We do want to hear what all Minnesotans think that we should do. There is no doubt at all that without collective action and really all of us doing something different, we cannot achieve our climate change goals. It just really is the problem is too big. It affects all aspects of our lives. And so I'd encourage all of you to go there. Now, for my agency, the Board of Water and Soil Resources, we are an environment agency, and we work in the natural working lands piece. That's kind of where our involvement is. And the things that I've learned in my experience, and I've been my own experience with state politics and state environmental policy, it goes back over 30 years, but working very directly on implementing programs really goes back about 17 years. And one thing that I have learned is that there are principally 2 ways to affect change on the landscape. One is you can regulate. You can tell people to do things differently, to use your land differently, to implement practices in a certain way. The other way you go is through incentives. You can incentivize people to do that through tax policy, through grant programs. And certainly if you're paying attention to politics, if you're here, you probably are, is that regulation is a pretty tough sell at this point in time. The last major regulation affecting natural lands was the riparian buffer program. I was very heavily involved in implementing that program, and the first few years were quite a challenge in that regard. People are not too excited about that. They push back real hard. You don't hear much about it anymore. People accepted it, and life has moved on. But a lot of the work that we're doing now really focus on incentives. How do we encourage people to change their agricultural practices? And when you keep in mind that in the state of Minnesota, we do have over half our total land area is devoted to agricultural production, either row crops, perennial crops like hay for grazing cattle. So it's a large share of the landscape. And what can we do to motivate all those farmers to change what they're doing to reduce their climate impact? Because keep in mind, they still have to earn a living, and that's kind of this idea of working lands. How do you integrate the changes in their tillage practices and nutrient management and increased use of cover crops so that they're reducing their impact while at the same time they're able to continue to earn a living, because that's why they're out there farming. It's my job is how I earn my living. Farmers through raising animals, and raising food on the land that we all consume. So this last session, I mean, there were two I would say initial starts that my agency has received appropriations and authority for to really kind of start going down this path, to start to figure out how do we do a better job of creating incentives for landowners and local governments to change their practices to reduce their climate change impact while they are continuing to farm the land. And one of those is a soil health and a soil health initiative. The amount of money we received is fairly small. It is only, hold on here, I should know this by heart, but I lost. I had my website here a second ago. We have I think it's $2 million out of general fund dollars to start a soil health initiative. Now we've done some early work, doing some piloting, because we need to learn how do you make this work for farmers. One of the biggest things we think we can do is get more vegetation on the landscape for larger parts of the year. If you're ever driving through agricultural parts of Minnesota in April and May, you're going to see a lot of black dirt out there. That's because farmers are waiting for their crops to grow up. That's a prime time for you. If you have rain events, the water is going to be less resilient to holding the water. That water, when it runs off, is going to carry soil particles and nutrients that are going to create pollution. And by not having plants on the ground, there's more likely going to be carbon is going to be going into the atmosphere as opposed to being sucked out by plants. And the same is true in the fall. Harvest is starting about now and start early in some places. There's going to be bare soil through millions of acres of the state of Minnesota. When we do that is through cover crops, where farmers can plant other plant species that can grow fast, can cover the ground, providing that resiliency, the adaptation, as well as a sequestration benefit into the landscape. And oh, by the way, if they do it often enough, it's going to also increase the vitality of their soil and improve their cropping. But it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. Some of the challenges that we face in the state of Minnesota is that it's our weather. We have a very short window for farmers to get those cover crops in the ground, and it's hard to be successful in that. So a big part of what we're looking for, and we are going to be seeking input into that program as well, is how do we help farmers figure out the best way to integrate cover cropping into their system? How do we help them do that in a way that works for them and provides the benefits that we're looking for? We're talking about an incentive-based program that's going to provide, funds to cover both the cost of insulation. There's some risks involved as well. So we're starting down that path, but we're talking millions of acres. You got to start somewhere. And our real goal is that if we get enough farmers that are doing this and doing it well, and they're showing that they're having a positive benefit to their economic bottom line, they'll tell their neighbors, then they'll start doing it. That's how you get systemic change. I mean, the work that we do can help start the process, but it's real people talking to the people they know to make a difference out there. And that's our ultimate goal, is get enough of that going on out there. The other one that's a much smaller scale, it's only $2 million, is on water storage. And that really is pretty straightforward and adaptation. We've seen in this state that we've had in both increasing amounts of rainfall as well as increasing large rainfall events. And the landscape across the state, both urban and in rural areas, has been significantly altered, where it does not manage water very well, period. But when it comes in large amounts in short periods of time, it doesn't manage it very well at all. We've had increasing amounts of flood events. Now, this last year has been a drought, but as we know, that's also a potential symptom of climate change as well. But how do we help build into our landscape ways to manage water better, so that we don't have those disastrous effects of flood damage, or at least less of that, or that we can have ways to hold water on the landscape so it's available for crops when land dries out as well too. So these are the two, very directly coming out of the governor's climate recommendations, is soil health and water storage, that we're just in the really early phases on. We view these as just starting to tiptoe down the path, but we view these very importantly as a foundation for how do we start to build something small, but to have a big impact over time. So that's just a few things about for the Walz administration, things are going on, as well as with my agency in the work that we are in fact doing. We can talk about a whole lot more things. We're involved with forestry, as you saw from one of Sashi's slides. We're doing a lot of work on wetland restorations all across the state and other landscape restoration that are not directly part of climate change, but have an impact nonetheless as well. So I'm happy to talk about more of those things as part of the conversation, any questions that the participants may have. So thank you again, Jim.
Thanks, Dave. And I just point out that the climate subcabinet has a number of technical action teams that are broken down by subject, and one of them actually is natural and working land. So if you do go to the website for the climate subcabinet, you can click through and find the work that they've been doing on this issue as well. Okay, now let's pass it off to John.
Thanks, Sachi, for the presentation. As someone focused on adaptation, it was a good reminder of the crossover between adaptation and mitigation efforts, how they really play off of each other and serve multiple purposes. A lot of the restoration work we're doing in South Washington County. And kind of thinking of that, and then thinking of what Dave was talking about, kind of working on the regulatory side or working voluntarily with landowners. And just, I get stuck thinking, it's not an either or, we need both. And we're constantly working in kind of the muddy middle ground between the two, and trying to figure out how to make that work for us. One example that we've been working on for a few years is down at Lake Middle School and Middleton Elementary School, the combined campus in Woodbury. The school district has done a couple of school improvement projects, both to the building and to the parking lot, that required stormwater treatment, as any development and redevelopment project in our district would require. But we weren't really interested in the larger stormwater pond on the site, or a new stormwater pond on the school campus site. So we worked with them to do an alternative, what we call an alternative compliance mechanism, by doing campus screening on the site instead of just another stormwater pond. So we worked with them and we helped them manage the project to restore 15 acres of their existing turf grass to native prairie, and planted over 200 trees on the campus, including a number of species of trees that aren't typically found in our part of Minnesota, but maybe would migrate north in the future. Some of those are successful, some of those not, but we keep trying them. I think that effort's been largely successful. We're still, the prairie's looking better. We still have some work to make it look great. But the school district is largely happy. A lot of the residents nearby are happy. Students are happy. They get to spend time in the prairie and outdoor classrooms we built as well. And we're carrying that pilot effort to a handful of other schools now. But kind of where we get stuck is right, we can do this alternative compliance process for a certain type of project in the district and a certain type of landowner. But how do we make that mainstream? How do we make those larger restoration efforts, which provide multiple benefits for adaptation and mitigation, count in our traditional regulatory framework for managing stormwater and development and redevelopment? And until we can do a better job of quantifying kind of the traditional benefit of some of that work, it's harder for us to get a lot of it done. We're kind of stuck on those certain types of development projects where we can do that work. But I think that's an important discussion to have, because it's, we can do a lot of the voluntary work. We can force some things regulatory wise, but there's a lot of it that plays off of each other, and we need them both, and we need to make things make sense in the world we live in.
Great, thanks, John. And now we'll go to our favorite son, our sustainability project member, Wally Watt.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thanks to Sachi for an excellent presentation. It touched a lot of bases that our team has been working on over the past 5 years. And each fall we've had an event like this. So this is the 5th event that we've hosted, and that's focused not only on our congregation, but also inviting the community into these discussions. And the first one was about climate change and renewable energy with Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. And the second one was getting to green with Conservation Minnesota, and how conservatives and progressives can get together on climate change issues. And then the third one was on water quality, and John helped us with that one. That was 2 years ago, I believe. And then last year, it was voting your values with the Minnesota League of Women Voters. And all of those, we've carried forward this discussion. And there are a couple of things that we're currently working on that I wanted to mention. And one is the grove of trees that we've taken, our congregation has taken the name from, is some beautiful trees. And we have heirloom trees, including 2 bur oaks that are over 250 years old. And as well as a lot of ash that were planted, and maples and some spruce. But in 2019, we commissioned an arborist to evaluate the health of our trees and to give us a care plan. And we're now working that plan, which includes not only removing some trees that were at risk, but also treating over 20 ash trees for emerald ash borer. And also we're going to be removing a number of ash trees that aren't worth saving. And so we have started to replace those trees with other species that are more tolerant to climate change going forward, like Kentucky coffee trees. And so that's going to continue. And the other project that we're starting this fall is restoring oak savanna native habitat. And unfortunately, we have a lot of buckthorn that has invaded our property. And so this fall, in a couple of weeks, we'll be starting to remove that buckthorn. And that's a multi-year process, as John knows, because they're doing the same thing in Cottage Grove Ravine Park. But then the fun part will be replacing that with native plants after the buckthorn is gone. And I'm pleased to say that we are working with the watershed district on that particular project. And specifically, personally, I've adopted that as my water steward capstone project this fall. So completion of that project, well, I can become a full-fledged water steward working with the South Washington Watershed District. So I think just one other thing I'd like to say, our team has also done a fair amount of public policy advocacy. And we've talked a lot about that. And we are linked with Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. And I am on the policy team that advocates both for federal and state public policy to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So whenever we have an opportunity to work with them, we do that to make our voices heard. So I think that's enough. We can maybe go to questions and answers.
That sounds like a good idea. I was going to offer up to the panelists the opportunity to raise the first question or two, if you have one, of either Sachi or any of the other panelists. So does anybody have a question that they'd like to start with?
All right, well, I'll start.
Oh, thank you, Wally.
I'm particularly interested in hearing John talk about the Watershed District. In 2018, they released a climate resiliency plan. And given the rapid changes in our climate, even since 2018, I'm particularly interested in the city of Woodbury and where is the highest risk for water catastrophic rainfalls in the city of Woodbury itself.
Thanks, Wally. I will actually go back to something Sachi said earlier about equity. Woodbury is actually very well positioned in terms of kind of traditional disasters we talk about with flooding and conservation and preservation of groundwater. It's a really engaged community. It's a community with a lot of resources to use on issues and addressing issues. It's a city with a very large and effective staff to operate things, maintain things. And we do have things we watch, right? So we for a number of years when the district was first formed, we addressed a number of smaller neighborhood flooding issues. More recently, we completed our large overflow project, which is a regional flooding a tool we have available to us to help the city of Woodbury kind of get large rain events, get stormwater from large rain events out of the city and safely to the Mississippi River. And we'll keep going back, and we are going back working with the city. As we get Alice 14 rainfall updates, we review that. So as we see, projected rainfall events kind of creep up, the rates creep up, we look at things again and find new areas to look at and work with the city through their existing programs to help homeowners further flood-proof their properties if they wish. But our biggest concerns in that plan are our river towns, frankly. Newport, St. Paul Park, some of our bluff areas along the St. Croix River where the soils are more erodible and have less established land cover. Those are our biggest concerns right now. Not to say that we don't keep working with the city of Woodbury, we certainly do. Got any other questions? I'm happy to field them, Wally. I do have a question for Sachi though as well. I'm wondering, in your efforts on that, 1 million acres of reforestation, are you and your partners doing anything to proactively kind of transition that forest composition? So are you using any species from down south that you expect to do better up here in the future?
A really great question, John. And I am not the expert on that program, so I welcome you to take everything I say with a grain of salt. Yes, and no. This million-acre effort is really in its infancy, and we're still kind of developing the framework through which that reforestation will happen. So I listed a whole big number of partners on that slide, but what doesn't show up there is that we really want to make sure this isn't a top-down effort. There's a huge amount of work that's going to go into engaging directly with communities that show up as kind of those hot spots on the map with big reforestation opportunity, and making sure that what we're talking about aligns with what they're looking for the community. And so I see that playing out in a couple of ways. You know, is reforestation a priority? What are you looking for from the reforestation? If it's a certain type of habitat, that probably impacts the type of trees we choose to plant, and so forth and so on. Our effort really is focused on climate adapted species, so we will absolutely do our best. And I do think that assisted migration will end up being part of the program. So assisted migration is exactly what you talked about earlier, John, when you think about, you know, we're going to pull a tree species that's normally, you know, in Iowa, and we're going to pull it up to Minnesota and see how it does, because we know we're getting warmer. So we're thinking about that too, and that will likely be part of the program. But honestly, the last factor that plays in here is, I mentioned that we currently don't have the capacity, the nursery capacity to grow enough seedlings to hit 1 million acres. So the final distribution of species may end up being skewed a little bit just based on what we can access to get in the ground as quickly as possible.
Hey, we're starting to get a number of questions coming in on the chat room. So the first is, and you know, this can be for anyone, but perhaps maybe Wally and John, if we were to do just one thing related to the natural world around our house or neighborhood for helping with climate change, what would you recommend?
Well, I'll go ahead while Wally works on getting unmuted, I think.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So one of the things I keep coming back to, and it's a solution for a number of different problems we see, is disconnecting the runoff, right? So you've got driveways that send water to the street, which sends it to the storm sewer. You've got rain gutters that may be close to a driveway. So anything you can do to slow water down, you don't have to stop it, right? You can put in a rain garden and catch the water and infiltrate it. But even just slowing it down and making it flow over some kind of vegetation, slow it down as much as you can. It benefits us water quality wise, rate wise, volume wise. It cleans up all the pollutants that might come off your driveway or your roof. It's something that's really easy to do, and it addresses, you know, almost all the problems we see in our lakes in the city of Woodbury.
Wally, do you have anything to add?
Well, I would second that. And if you are able, constructing a rain garden on your property is one of the best things you can do, especially if you're close to a water, a lake, or a stream. But you can also adopt a adopt a drain program. There's adopt a drain program. And so in your neighborhood, you can make sure the stormwater drains are cleaned and there isn't any leaves or grass clippings that are going down the stormwater drain. And that's easy to do. You can Google adopt a drain in Minnesota and do that in your neighborhood.
Jim, if I just add to that, you know, talk about a somewhat different topic of this question. This is a really important element. There's so much residential, you know, landscape in this state. You know, another thing that all of us can do is to you know, tear up some of that turf grass you got everywhere. That's also a pain in the butt. You know, I mowed my lawn yesterday, and we'll have to again probably in 4 days, because this is perfect grass growing season in Minnesota, as we all know. And tear it up and do some native plantings. They have a deeper rootstock, so they hold more carbon in the deeper root system. And on top of that, you do some research, we have great resources on our website. You may have heard of the Lawns to Legumes program. That's a program that's geared towards residential landscapes. What can all of us do who live in these areas to plant native species that are attractive to pollinators and other beneficial insects? So it provides you these multiple benefits of both reducing the amount of effort you have around your home, providing habitat for our insects that are in decline, not just pollinators, but all species, and they also provide carbon sequestration benefits as well. So I think there's a lot going on there, and we have a lot of resources on our website that can be helpful to all of us in doing a better job with the piece of land that we're responsible for.
I love the direction this is going, and I totally agree. And I just want to, one more time emphasize something that John said about the water management. In terms of solutions with multiple benefits, if you want to talk about bang for your buck in terms of the time and the resources you're investing in a project, I think thinking about more vegetation that slows down water is one of those where it just touches down in every area. And one area that we actually sometimes don't think about in terms of stormwater management is that with climate change, we're seeing more bigger rain events, right? So rather than just one mega storm every 10 years, it's a mega storm every year and like a mega storm every 10 years. And that means that our infrastructure has to be able to handle that or we see flooding. And so by being able to slow down that water, you also slow down the urgency for the city or the municipality to have to replace your pipes with bigger pipes to get rid of the stormwater, and reduce the urgency of having to take some drastic measures to reduce erosion going into the river. And so all of those little small actions, even if it's just in your yard or in front of your church or something like that, those all contribute to reducing the financial impact that we're going to see going into the future as well.
I have another question from the chat room, but it really kind of goes back to something I think Dave mentioned. It is, if I were to, if I wanted to use a cover crop for my garden, what should I plant? And I think Dave mentioned, actually changing over to perennials would be a good idea, and then you wouldn't be switching out all the time. But what would you do if you're not doing that and you still wanted to have some benefit for water quality? And
well, of course, we're talking garden, talking a vegetable garden, or just kind of some landscape plants. It kind of depends upon what the person is looking for. If you're talking about your landscaped areas, I know a lot of people do, like my wife included, likes to do some annuals because they get different kind of plant species, different kinds of flowers. So they provide a different appearance to your property, kind of coming and going a little bit. But there are native species that you can apply there as well. When it comes to a vegetable garden, if that's the other part of the answer, I also am not the best person to. I'm sorry, my cat fan wants to say hi. I guess I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure what resources we have to that. Other places to go to get some information on that is there are master gardeners. They can be very helpful in responding to these and any other kinds of questions that you might have about vegetation on your property. As well as probably your soil water conservation district here in Washington County also would be some good resources. And even I would imagine the watershed district, John and his folks could probably help with some of that as well too, of what might you be able to do within a garden area on your property.
That's happened. Oh, sorry, John, go ahead.
So my first recommendation would be just to leave whatever plants you have planted where they are over winter. So whether they're garden plants that die out or perennials that die out for the winter, just leave that dead vegetation there in place. And then when spring comes, it'll help hold the soil in place while the plants get going again in the spring.
Yeah, that's a great point. One other suggestion I was going to have, if you are thinking of vegetable garden, I know Mother Earth Gardens in the cities has a great actual stock of cover crop seeds if you want to go and kind of poke around. But I think in addition to leaving plants that you can, I know I just went through this with my garden because we harvested our lettuce, right? And we harvested our basil. And so there wasn't a lot of cover there anymore. So we left the roots to provide some of that structure, but we also actually root plants, things like radishes, can be really good cover crops because they help with the soil structure. And once they die next year, right, the plant was using photosynthesis, that root of the radish or whatever is now just chock full of carbon, and it basically decays in the next season to put more of that carbon back into your soil. So I am not a farming or gardening expert, but that's one option that you could think about, is how are you keeping more carbon on a landscape?
I'm going to exercise my moderator's prerogative and ask John a question about, rather than incentives, looking at the stick of regulation. And are you aware of many cities, particularly in the East Metro, that have like forest preservation ordinances or ordinances to protect existing wetlands that are doing decent jobs?
Yes and no. Yes, in that there are mechanisms in place, right? We obviously have, various levels of protection for wetlands. Those are more geared at just keeping wetlands in place, and primarily the hydrological benefits that come from them. A number of cities have tree preservation ordinances that's largely based on aesthetic considerations, just keeping trees in place in neighborhoods. Not a lot, though, that ties kind of the natural benefits of those wetlands and woodlands to the traditional regulatory framework we live in. Somewhere along the line, we still have to show that we're meeting the total phosphorus load requirements leaving a site. We're meeting the rate requirements leaving the site, and the volume requirements leaving the site, both for our own local ordinances, but also to meet state standards that are propagated down through cities and counties. And so that's kind of the area that we get stuck in. There's a number of people interested in it. It's a topic at just about every water related conference you go to in the last decade. There's somebody talking about how to estimate water quality benefit of a tree. Right? And you can extend that to any other plant in a wetland or in an ag field. Just a hurdle we have to get through, and it's a hurdle we don't have good answers for right now.
Okay. Another question from the chat room is, as the climate warms, will there be any unexpected agricultural benefits that will help reduce further climate warming, like making it easier to plant cover crops in the spring and the fall?
That is a good question, and I say observation, actually. We do know in more southern states there is a greater adoption of cover crops, in part because they have a wider window of opportunity to get them established before winter sets in. So I think that is a likely outcome of a warmer world, is that cover cropping will become easier in Minnesota than is currently the case. So I would expect that to be the case.
So I think it's a cultural thing, right? I mean, I grew up in Iowa, and there's cover crops all over in Iowa, and they just had different practices for tilling and planting in the spring. I think in Minnesota, it's still a cultural thing to, part of ending the year is going out and tilling stuff up and getting that field looking nice and black and smooth. So I think it's, you're dealing with climate change and water quality and land stewardship. You're also dealing with, tradition and culture.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. You do hear these stories of farmers saying that they were taught by their dad that, the sign of a good farmer is having that nice black soil at the end of the season. But I know I also have been told that there is a practical consideration, is that black soil is going to warm up faster, so they can maybe plant their crop in earlier. So that's another consideration in there. But I think I think you're right. Is that it is a cultural thing, in part because it hasn't been done. Therefore, it's kind of harder to break through because one thing about farmers, they do tend to be risk adverse because they make a decision. It could have some negative income repercussions to them as well too. So if they've been doing it a certain way and it's worked for them, it's pretty tough to change it, and that is an important barrier that needs to be kind of broken through to expand that practice across the state.
Yeah, and
Thank
that's
you.
where, I'm sorry. I say that's where we, the focus of the voluntary efforts that we do pursue are on getting some of those initial landowners in ag areas to try something new, experiment a little bit, and if something works, get them to talk to their neighbors about it.
Yeah, I was just going to add, to Dave's earlier point about the need for incentive programs across the state. One of the challenges with things like cover cropping is you actually are somewhat locked in if you make the choice to transition your practices, depending on how you do it, because you need a different type of equipment. You need a different type of drill to plant seeds in a field that still has cover crops on it, and things like that. And so, yeah, there are certainly a number of barriers to uptake there, that I think we're sort of just, my perception is we're kind of just starting to figure them out.
Yeah, and the things that we can do with our efforts is it's easier to address the financial considerations, the cost of equipment, the cost of the additional seed. I mean, those are things that government programs can do to defray some of the cost. We also can address some of the risk factors, because again, if you're changing your practices, there's some risk there. How might that impact the cropping next year? What might that impact be? But this issue of how to get people to start in the first place, if we can take provide incentives through, again, money for equipment, for seed, to address some of that risk of production impact. That's kind of one way to make it a little easier to get over that barrier of the way they've always done things.
Okay, I want to come back to the issue of urban forests, and although I understand the wedge of greenhouse gas emission reduction is fairly small out of all of the ideas that Sachi has identified, it seems to me that the co-benefits that come from it really play out importantly, particularly when you're interested in the equity of climate action. And one of the questions from the chat room is someone wanting to get involved in urban tree planting projects around the metro as a service project, and what they're looking for groups that would be engaged in that kind of thing.
Yeah, there are a number. And before we get into the names, I did want to share, you just kind of raised one additional resource in my mind, Jim, which is the tree equity score. I don't know if you all have come across this, but there was an effort to map, right, what is like the tree density and health basically across the US, and therefore what are the equity considerations specific to trees? And that does show up kind of in the metro area. If you're interested in engaging, I think there are a couple places I would point you to. One is Tree Trust. They're doing some pretty comprehensive work and leading a lot of efforts across the greater metro area. Family of Trees is doing some really interesting work in North Minneapolis. And then the Shade Tree Advisory Council is a place that they send out newsletters. They might be a place where you would want to just check for information and opportunities. It's actually I believe it's like a public-private entity that was created by the state, but it's actually led by the same woman who leads Tree Trust, Karen Zumak. And they really do a lot of thinking and work and advocacy, thinking about where the need is for urban tree canopy. The
other place that I would suggest is there is a new Methodist church being established in Minneapolis. It's called the New City Church. And one of their organizing efforts is planting fruit trees in urban neighborhoods, not just for the shade value and all of that, but also for the fruit itself and to help with the diets of the people in the neighborhoods. So if you look for it, look for Reverend Tyler Sitt at the New City Church.
I also want to commend the Grove Church for managing your existing tree canopy. I think maintaining what we have is something that's far too often overlooked by folks. There's a lot more involved with establishing a tree than just putting it in the ground.
Well, that's Wally for you. There's a question about in teaching young children about climate change. It's not easy, but they understand photosynthesis. Sachi's graphic showed a sunflower. This is an easy project for children 4 to 8. Sunflowers are a good choice, or are sunflowers a good choice for plantings like this?
I would vote yes. On the climate side, they have a huge taproot. So they're, in terms of root systems, they're getting a lot of biomass and carbon into the ground. Also, they're my favorite flower, so I would definitely say, yeah, go with sunflowers.
Have you noticed more sunflowers this year? I feel like they're everywhere.
It seems like it. With the hot and dry, I wonder if other things didn't survive. And so proportionally, we just have more. Is that your sense, John?
Maybe. I think this was a very good climate year for sunflowers in Minnesota, not good for everything else.
This is for anyone who might have an answer. Will the University of Minnesota's Forever Green new cover crops like Kernza help farmers with cash crop cover crop?
Yes, I can speak to that to a degree. We actually do work with the university and Forever Green, look for opportunities to expand the amount of perennial cropping systems there are across the state. And Kernza is only the most noteworthy out of other plants they are currently working on for these multiple benefits. Again, the idea is that the way Kernza works is you plant it 1 year, and you get anywhere from 3 to 4 years of production off that before you have to kind of renew the cropping system, renew the Kernza in there. So those are 3 or 4 years, where once every 3 or 4 years, where the farm is not required to disturb the soil by planting. They're not required to drive their equipment over the field, thereby burning diesel and increasing the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere as well. So they provide a lot of those benefits. And the Kernza has a much deeper root system that again, it helps sequester carbon. It increases the organic content of the soil and the ability of the soil to hold and maintain water as well. So lots of benefits there. There are other crops that they're working on as well that are more of a traditional cover crop. But the difference, what they're looking for, is a way that they are harvestable, and there are several oil seeds that they are working on that provide this dual benefit, where you can interplant with like soybeans now the name of the plant's going to elude me, where you can harvest the seeds from the new cover crop as a way to generate income for there as well as kind of continue to have the regular soybeans or corn, as the case might be. So they're looking for a lot of opportunities to get more perennials, kind of more vegetation on the landscape that have an economic potential. They're trying to, again, directly speak to the economic incentives of people as well too. And Sashi makes a very good point. Kernza is not a traditional cover crop. That's absolutely correct. It is more comparable to it is a form of wheat, in effect. It's an intermediate wheatgrass that performs more like a traditional annual cropping system in terms of the annual production that comes off of it. So thank you for that clarification, Sashi.
Hey, Dave, do you know if Bowser's doing any work on the market side of some of these alternative crops? A lot of the concern we hear from farmers is, in addition to trying something new and being risk averse, we also get the responses of, well, what am I going to do with this crop when I harvest it? Where am I going to take it? Who's going to want it?
That's not really our sweet spot, I will say, in terms of work that we do. But you're absolutely correct, is that if there's not a market, who's going to grow it? I mean, that's not what farmers do. So that's a big part of it, is as we're partnering on initiatives with the university, that's a big part of what they're doing, is the entire supply chain that goes into any kind of crop, from the planting advice to the harvesting and to the marketing at the end as well too. So whenever we're building an initiative and trying to expand the reach of that, that's always a component of how do you make sure that there's an opportunity at the end to market the grain that they're producing.
I think there are also some opportunities that could impact your kind of bottom line that wouldn't necessarily have to be market opportunities too for some cover crops. So you hear a lot about folks who are grazing cattle on their cover crops in the winter, right? So you have your cover crops growing for a couple months, say September, October until January, and then your cattle are grazing on kind of the dead plant matter. So you had plants on the ground for a couple extra months, you have some extra roots in the soil, and then you're not paying for food for a couple of months. And so that's not a cash crop. You're not selling that for anything. But if you are on a farm that kind of has those different systems at play, it can be a way to reduce your expenses on the other side. Does that sound right, Dave?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Is that, especially, that again, that is a benefit of Kearns, is that you can harvest the straw that can be used for animal bedding. It can be used for feed. So that's another economic use for Kearns, again, as example. And just once you bring in cattle as well too. I mean, we do a lot of agricultural landscapes, and it might be a little counterintuitive, but having cattle on a landscape does provide soil health benefits as well, in terms of providing a little bit of churn in the soil. They also provide the manure that self-fertilizes. So if one of the things that we do look for opportunities to integrate, cattle into some of these operations as well too, as a way of providing a more sustainable landscape.
It's actually a tool we're trying to use increasingly in prairie restoration projects, getting some kind of grazing. Potentially the bigger the animal, the better, because it seems like that was certainly an essential part of maintaining our native prairies at some point.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know in the backyard, but
thank you all very much for all the others on either Facebook or Zoom. There are a lot of really good resources that people have been adding in the chat room. Please check that out. We have kind of hit our time limit. I really want to thank all of the panelists and Sachi for sticking the landing on the time allocation. It's been really great. Anyway, so again, the Sustainability Project does hold these events in the spring and the fall. We hope you'll keep an eye out for what we might do in the spring, and check us out on the web. So I want to thank everyone again, and wish you a good evening, and hopefully we'll see you again.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you very much as well.
Thank you.